From Nine's wide world of sports, this is Stories of Origin.
And out they come here at Long Beach, California, for the very first State of Origin rugby league encounter ever played here in the United States.
We're in America. Have a look at this. Just remember it's, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Bugs Bunny, mate. We're here for a good time, right? And he goes, yeah, no problem, fat. And, mate, we pack into the scrum and he headbutts me. And I go, oh, my God, this is going to be the longest night ever. And he headbutted me every scrum for the next 78 minutes.
The podcast series available wherever you get your podcasts. Stories of Origin.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Tuesday, May 30th. For millennia, Wreck Bay, a tiny Indigenous village on the south coast of New South Wales, was paradise. But in the last few decades, a remarkable number of residents have died or become sick. They've suffered from heart attacks, kidney disease, and cancer after cancer. Today, investigative reporter Carrie Fellner on the toxic chemicals that locals argue have poisoned Wreck Bay, and why the Australian government hasn't banned these dangerous chemicals that are seeing people all over the country mounting class action lawsuits. So, Carrie, can you tell me about Wreck Bay and the community that lives there?
Yeah, so Wreck Bay is an Aboriginal community about 200 kilometres south of Sydney, and it's near the sort of internationally recognised white sands of Hyams Beach at Jervis Bay. So it's a really familiar area for tourists from Sydney. About 1.4 million people go there on holidays every year. So it's within a national park on land that actually got handed back to the traditional owners in the 1980s. And so it's sort of a beautiful community right on the headland there, overlooking the water. You've got white sands and turquoise waters, ocean cliffs everywhere. It's an absolutely spectacular part of the world.
Okay, and so you've spent 2 years investigating what's happened in Wreck Bay. So can you tell me what the residents there have told you about all of the, relatively young people who've become sick or died in a relatively short period of time? I know you've written that one woman told you, there's a lot of people I did know growing up who did pass away, and I guess when I was a bit younger, no one would really say what happened to them. They would just disappear.
That's right. So that quote came from a young lady, Sharia Matson, and she was so struck by the level of illness in her village that when she was in year 12 and she was asked to do a major work, she actually wanted to study illness in the village and try and get to the bottom of why everyone was so sick. In particular, she'd been struck by losing women that were close to her, women in her family, and seeing other families lose their matriarchs, and sort of the ripple effect that had in terms of passing culture down from generation to generation, and also, caring for the children. They were losing these mother figures in their lives. So she wanted to look into, well, is my community more sick than other Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory? And then when I came in about 2 years ago, that was the line. Every single person that you spoke to just had these terrible stories of loss.
My dad's got heart trouble. My Uncle Mitchum, he's the youngest. He lives at Wreck Bay. He just had triple heart bypass surgery last year.
Wow.
Oh, my gosh.
There's a lot of people in that cemetery that are men and women that are young and that passed away from heart attacks and cancer.
There's two big ones. We spoke to a man called Uncle Finno, and he has been through so much tragedy in his own family. He has 10 siblings, and every single one of them in his family, including himself, have had either heart problems or cancer. So he's lost several of his siblings to that. And he was telling this story about in the year 2000 that one of his brothers had a heart attack and he had to rush down to Maruya to go and see them. And he went with one of his siblings, and that sibling knelt down next to the brother and said, oh, if I could swap places with you, I would. Like, he was that upset. And then 2 hours later, he had a heart attack and died. So it was just kind of overwhelming. We were at the cemetery in Wreck Bay one day, and this lovely man came down, Ronald McLeod, and he had lost his niece. She died in her sleep one night, and then the next day his daughter died from bowel cancer. So just losing 2 close family members in the space of 2 days. And they weren't elderly, these were people in their 40s, in their 50s. We had younger people getting cancer. We've heard of several people in the community with cancer who are in their 20s. So that was one of the things that really stood out from the investigation. It was, these aren't really elderly people who are dying. We're losing all these young people who aren't even making it into their 40s and things like that.
And Carrie, you've written that Wreck Bay has experienced, a really remarkably high amount of premature deaths in comparison with other parts of the country. So just how high are we talking about here?
Yeah, that's right. I was able eventually to find some data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and that to me was quite astonishing, because what I found was that in 2017, Wreck Bay actually had the highest rate per head of population of premature years of life lost, and that in 3 other years during the decade that the data was collected, it was the second highest in Australia. So, and that year in 2017, that it was the highest in Australia. That was actually the worst result recorded for any location at any point in time during the entire decade that data was collected. And that year that happened, they had 4 people die in the space of a year. And when I was down there last year, they had 6 people die in the space of 5 months. So you're only talking 400 people that are associated with this community. So it's, as a proportion of the population, it's really high. And what that shows is that since this data was collected, they seem to be doing even worse.
Right. And so from your writing, it's become clear that locals are feeling such despair over the years, sort of in searching for, what exactly was going on here. Was all this illness hereditary, or, was it just bad luck? Was it something more sinister? So you've been looking into this. What have you found? What is going on in Wreck Bay?
Yeah, there's been a lot of soul searching that's been happening there. In 2016, meetings were held and the Department of Defence disclosed to the community, we've had this pollution that's been running off our defence base down the hill through the creek that runs through the heart of your community. And this is a creek that's been used by members of the community every day for swimming, for fishing. They had little kids at 5 or 6 years of age playing in this creek. It was disclosed to the community that creek had very high levels of PFAS. It's a type of chemical that's also known as forever chemicals. The chemicals were actually used in firefighting foams for training on the base. And that base was a training site not just for the Navy down at Jervis Bay, but it was a training site where naval officers from all over Australia were sent to do firefighting training at the base. So they had a really high volume of that foam go down into the community. So what I actually found through Freedom of Information documents I obtained was that they were actually setting alight things like aviation fuel, diesel, furnace oil and paint. So those would be set alight in pans and then smothered with the firefighting foam. And then that entire cocktail of dangerous substances was ending up running off into this creek that ran right down into the heart of Wreck Bay.
Okay, and so can you tell us a bit, what is PFAS? What are these chemicals that are, found in the things that they were lighting and that is making its way into the creek at Wreck Bay?
So PFAS chemicals were invented in the 1940s, and that was when they joined carbon and fluorine together, and they found basically it was like the strongest chemical bond ever known to humankind. So it was incredibly effective at repelling grease and oil and water, and incredibly effective in this firefighting foam that was used by the military. And in the military, it's all about how fast you can smother the flames and doing it in a certain amount of seconds. And this was by far the most effective material they'd ever seen. But the thing about these chemicals as well was that they just didn't break down in the environment. So they last for hundreds, if not thousands of years in the environment and also in the human body. They last for years and years, so they just cycle around in your body and your body finds it very difficult to sort of rid yourself of them. But firefighting foam is just one of the uses. They've been used in all sorts of household products. So formerly they were the key ingredient in Teflon frying pans and they're still used in non-stick frying pans, just a different type. They've also been the key ingredient in Scotchgard. And today, various types of PFAS are used in makeup, in school uniforms. They're in food packaging, so like your greaseproof paper. They found them in bottled water. They've just found them in so many different things. There was a study the other day showing that they think they're even in contact lenses. So the Department of Health has said they can be found in the blood of basically everyone in the population, in polar bears in the Arctic, on the top of Mount Everest. And then what I have found is that the health advice is really different depending on where you are. So in Europe and in the United States, they say the chemicals are a human health hazard that have been linked to high cholesterol, suppression of the immune system, various types of cancer, reproductive effects, developmental effects in children. But here in Australia, our government sort of denies that that's the case. And they say that any health effects of PFAS are only minimal and it hasn't been proved to cause disease.
I mean, that's definitely worrying. And my understanding is Australia's the only OECD country that hasn't banned these chemicals, PFOS, the most dangerous of these chemicals. So can you tell me about this and about the various lawsuits that the Australian government is now defending against its use of these chemicals?
Yeah, that's right. So in 2009, the most dangerous of these chemicals, PFOS, which is the one that has polluted Wreck Bay and has been found at high levels in the Australian population in the past, it was added to the Stockholm Convention, which is a United Nations convention that basically seeks to outlaw dangerous chemicals. And so we're actually a party to that convention here in Australia. And for some reason, we have chosen not to ratify that decision. So 160 other countries around the world have all said, yes, we'll ban PFOS, but for whatever reason, it hasn't happened here in Australia. And the other thing is that the Australian government's been sort of facing this huge liability over its use of the chemicals. So in 2020, it faced its first lawsuit over PFAS, and that was from the first 3 communities that were found to be contaminated with the firefighting foam. It paid them out $212 million. Those were Williamtown in New South Wales, Katherine in the Northern Territory, and Oakey in Queensland. And those were basically the first communities that were told by Defence they'd been contaminated because they had quite high levels of pollution comparatively. So, and then last week we saw the next 7 communities get payouts, and so they were collectively paid a total of $132 million.
So, Carrie, I mean, it brings us naturally to this class action lawsuit that residents of Wreck Bay have brought against the Australian government. I mean, at the time we're talking, it hasn't settled. But can you take us through what's happening there?
Yeah, so they were one of 8 communities that launched an action in 2021, and theirs was kind of unique compared to the other communities because they sued not only for stress and vexation and loss of value in their land, but also for cultural loss. It's been really eye-opening to spend time down there with the community and see all the different ways that they used the land and treasured the land. So up near the base, there were these clay pits, and all the kids used to go to the clay pits and they would smear the ochre all over themselves, and that would be used to paint themselves up before dance. They would use that clay as sunscreen to put on sores. The other story that really stood out from people was the fact that the pregnant women even used to go up there and they would actually eat the clay because that was in a time when they didn't have a lot of money or access to prenatal vitamins or anything like that. And so the clay would actually be used because it was full of all these minerals to nourish the unborn baby, and the calcium in the clay would help its bones to grow strong. So it was a really poignant story. And then when you find out that clay hole is actually full of quite high levels of PFAS, I guess it just, it's so stark, that contrast, and so sort of horrifying to think about how far the PFAS has infiltrated. Fishing has also been a mainstay of that community, and you had all these stories about the mobs of fishermen on the beach and that they would just be laughing and laughing and laughing the whole day, and fishing was physical survival in a village where people didn't have much money, and it was also sort of spiritual survival, this connection to the land, and that the land was nourishing them and giving them this beautiful diet of fresh seafood. And people in Wreck Bay know their seafood more than anyone, and they talked about, going and getting pippies off the beaches and lobster and abalone, amazing diet of seafood. And that has now not really available to them in the same way. They have been told that they can't go and get the yabbies from the creek. They've been told, you can still fish off the beaches if you want, but that's concerning to them because they know that these contaminated creeks, all the runoff is entering the beach. The big question at the moment is, how do you put a price on culture, and is any amount of money ever enough to atone for what they've lost, which is, this sacred spiritual connection to the land and waters that they have, that they're still fighting to somehow keep it alive. But how do you do that when you know that the waters are full of poison, basically?
Thank you, Carrie, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
On Thursday last week, the Department of Defence agreed to pay $22 million to the Wreck Bay Aboriginal Community Council. It was an historic settlement achieved just days before the case was due to go to trial in the federal court. The money is to compensate the community for cultural loss and property damage. It is not, said Justice Michael Lee, related to any health difficulties community members may have suffered. Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Hannah Mills-Turbot. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.
From Nine's wide world of sports, this is Stories of Origin.
And out they come here at Long Beach, California for the very first State of Origin rugby league encounter ever played here in the United States.
We're in America. Have a look at this. Just remember it's, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Bugs Bunny, mate. We're here for a good time, right? And he goes, yeah, no problem, fat. And, mate, we pack into the scrum and he headbutts me. And I go, oh, my God, this is going to be the longest night ever. And he headbutted me every scrum for the next 78 minutes.
The podcast series available wherever you get your podcasts. Stories of Origin.